Welcome to Madang. Today's special guest is Dr. Jemar Tisby on his book, How to Fight Racism, Young Readers Edition. He shares about racism, his framework called ARC to fight racism, concept of race, and how to work for racial justice, and so much more. Please stay tuned. Homebrewed Christianity is holding Theology Beer Camp October 13 to 15 at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Homebrewed is bringing together a bunch of podcasters, scholars, and people who like to nerd out when they party. They want to create a pop-up community of those zesty people who enjoy a quality God pod in their ears. Please join me and many others. Use discount code Madang to get $50 off registration. For more information, go to www.homebrewedchristianity.onepages.co/tbc22/. Madang is sponsored by Methodist Theological School in Ohio. MTSO provides theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. MTSO's 5 graduate degrees include the Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Social Justice, and Doctor of Ministry. Learn more at www.mtso.edu. Please join Global Justice leader Lisa Sharon Harper as she hosts the Alley Tour 2022. It is a 4 nights of conversation, woman to woman, on democracy, faith, and the fate of America. It will be held October 3rd, 10th, 17th, 24th, leading up to the November 8th midterm elections. For more information and tickets, go to www.thealleytour.com.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com. This is Madang, an outdoor living room for guests to share their experiences and their work. I invite you to come in and stay for a while.
Welcome to Madang. Today's very special guest is Dr. Jemar Tisby, who is the co-founder and CEO of The Witness Incorporated and a New York Times bestselling author of The Color of Compromise. He is an author, national speaker, public historian of race and religion who is featured in the Washington Post, CNN, and The Atlantic. He has a PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. Today, it's such an honor to have you with me, Dr. Tisby, and to share your book, How to Fight Racism, a Young Readers Edition. So thank you so much for coming on.
I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're one of the endorsers, Dr. Kate Bowler, who is a professor at Duke and a New York Times bestselling author of Everything Happens for a Reason, writes, "Our children need to learn the truth about the history of race in America. This powerful book will inspire young minds to pursue compassion, knowledge, and the necessary work of racial justice in their lives of faith." So thank you so much for coming. And there's so much to discuss from your book. But before we get into the book, I just wanted to ask you about The Witness Incorporated. Can you just share us a little bit about that and how you co-founded it?
They are going to be writing books about The Witness Inc. one day. I am convinced. We are trying to live in the light of the legacy of history and make history ourselves. So what The Witness is a Black Christian collective. We address issues of race, faith, culture, all from a distinctly Black and Christian perspective. We don't believe that those two are mutually exclusive, that we should somehow have to leave our race, our ethnicity, our culture at the door in order to be Christian, which, by the way, is often what is the sort of unstated practice or expectation when you enter into predominantly white Christian, especially evangelical spaces. So we are there as, we often say, we're not the voice, we're the microphone. So there's no one univocal Black Christian voice. there are many voices, and we try to pass the mic to them. So our ministry includes a website, thewitnessinc.com, and then we have two branches. One is the Black Christian Collective, which is education, inspiration, writing, blogging, all of that. The other is our newer branch, and that is the Witness Foundation. The cornerstone of the Witness Foundation is an incredible fellowship where 5 Black Christian leaders get $50,000 apiece, each for 2 years. So a total of $100,000 investment in Black Christian leadership. And we invest in the person. So no matter where they go or what they end up doing later, they get mentorship, they get the money, they get training, and all of that. So you can access all of our work through thewitnessinc.com.
Wow. So I said it wrong. Then it's the Witness Inc. I said Incorporated, so I apologize for that.
No, that's right. That's
But
right.
that
Yeah.
is okay. It's right. Okay. That is amazing. I checked out the website, and it is an amazing website, and there is a donation button. So for those listeners who want to donate for this cause, please go there and donate as little as $5. So I'm so excited. I can't believe, so $50,000.
Yeah, listen, I told you they're going to be writing history books about us because I'm a historian. And so right now I'm looking back, 30, 40, 50 years, and I'm saying, what was the Christian presence in times of upheaval, particularly around racial justice? What was the Christian witness? And what we want is to be a witness, hence the name, for racial justice, for justice of all kinds in our day. What the fellowship does is says, listen, we're in the next generation of the civil rights movement, and we have another generation of Black Christian leaders. So just like, the you've had on Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, others of that nature, they weren't the last ones, not by any means. There are more coming along. And so we want to fund and resource. And the problem is, as people of color, we're often locked out of the access to those financial resources in particular.
Yes.
And then B, as people of faith, there aren't a whole ton of very robust fellowships that are looking particularly at ways of approaching justice from a faith perspective. So we wanted to combine those two, and we wanted to have a transformative impact. So that $50,000 a year number is us saying, well, what would make a transformative difference in the lives of these nonprofit leaders? So ostensibly you could quit your job, or you could hire someone else without those kinds of, but it's unrestricted. We trust the leaders, and we just want to invest in them, believing that there is right now a generation of Black Christian leaders doing great work. And they've done incredible work already. Imagine what they could do if they had the resources they need.
Yeah, $50,000 to do it. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And for those who are interested, please go check out the Witness Inc. online. And there's a lot of information. So thank you. And just the way you talk in this book, I just think that you're some ordained minister, but you're not ordained minister, right?
I'm ordained through my local church.
You are? Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
you are.
I'm primarily a historian and an author. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So you wrote the adult version, and then today we're going to discuss this, the youth edition, the young readers edition. And it's so interesting to me because I have 3 kids, they're older now, so they're beyond this age bracket that you geared it towards. But how did you end up doing this for the young readers edition? That's amazing that you were able to do this. So how did you get this to start, or did they approach you?
I'm glad you asked, and I'll let you in on a secret. I think this version for young readers is probably even more accessible for adults than the adult version because for young people, you really have to break it down. So I think this could easily be read. It's geared toward ages 8 and up. It can easily be read by that age group, junior high, definitely high school, but also beyond. Some of the special, so you can read it along with your young person and not feel like, you're just immersed in this, bubblegum world, whatever it might be. So they approached me about the book. To be honest, writing a book for young people, for me, is intimidating because you have to be so clear,
Yeah.
precise. You have to
Mm-hmm.
give the proper you could, especially when you're talking about something like racism, like
Yeah. Uh-huh.
actually one of the hardest parts
Uh-huh.
is just explaining racism, because
Mm-hmm.
when you try to break it down, it's so illogical. It just doesn't make sense.
Uh-huh.
Trying to explain this to okay, so there's this system that people invented, that because people have different color skins, they're like they're worth more, they have more opportunities, and it's like, what? How does someone's appearance lead to
Yeah.
all of this stuff? And so breaking all that down, talking about race-based chattel slavery, talking about Jim Crow segregation, talking about white supremacy, it's very challenging, not just because you have to make it accessible for young people, but when you really break it down, it doesn't make sense. There's an internal logic,
Yeah.
but there's,
Mm-hmm.
in the grand scheme of things, it's very nonsensical.
Yeah. And I write, and for adults, you can just put all these quotes and
Yes.
fill up
Yeah.
the pages. But for young kids, you got right to the point. I thought it was so accessible. And as you mentioned, I think it's a great book actually for adults to
That's
read in
right.
the churches and beyond. It's almost like a textbook version. And it's like so well written. It's so accessible. And then you write questions at the end, and you have a
Mhm.
glossary at the end of the book. It is such an accessible book. So I actually really enjoyed it. And I have to tell my kids, now that I'm done with it, I have to tell my kids to read it, because
Good.
you did such a great job. Because yeah, you said racism doesn't make any sense, but you're trying to make sense of it. And
Right.
young kids of color are all going through this.
That's right. That's
So
right.
yeah, so when I was reading it, I was wondering, because you had to make it for children, for younger adults, um, is there challenges that are different for younger teens? I don't know if
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
felt it while you were trying to revise it for the younger version than adults. And if so, can you tell us what those are?
There's a bunch of different challenges.
Mhm, mhm.
One is the constantly changing landscape.
Oh,
Change is
okay.
happening so fast now. I mean, think of the racial landscape, even just like 2015, in 2015, prior to the election of Donald Trump, prior to
Mhm,
all of these things happening. Think about in the past 10 years or so, like before Trayvon Martin and after Trayvon Martin. And it seems to constantly be speeding up. We can even look at January 6th and the insurrection,
mhm.
and see that there are racial elements in that as well. So by the time you put the words on a page, something new or different has happened and has changed. So that was a challenge, is trying to give sort of timeless principles in an age where the landscape is shifting rapidly, is one challenge. Another challenge is, we talk about the 2040, 2050 window when white people will no longer be the majority.
Yeah.
They'll be
Mhm.
the largest in a plurality of
Yeah.
people groups. Well, that window is already happening with young people. In our
Mm.
public schools, recently, I
Mm.
think it was 2019, don't quote me on that, but in our public schools, um,
Uh-huh.
they're majority minority. That class coming in is already majority Black and brown, and other folks. So with young people, the challenge is, well, we're already diverse. We see lots
Yeah.
of different people. Why are you still talking about racism? That's a thing of the past, or it doesn't affect us, or we're all
Mhm.
against racism. What does this have to do with us? So the challenge is to help young people understand, no, this is still relevant to you. Number one, it is relevant because where you go to school, the quality of education that you get, the kind of job opportunities that you get, the kind of networks and resources that you have access to, whether you're conscious of it or not, that's still all very highly affected by race. And I can also speak from personal experience. I grew up in the Midwest, in the north suburbs of Chicago,
Mm.
and we were incredibly racially and ethnically diverse. And what that did was, we wouldn't have called it then this at that time, but what it did was give you a sense of being post-racial. Like, all these people are together, we're getting along just fine. What's the big deal? It wasn't until I moved down south to the deep south of the Delta that I started to understand and see more clearly just how racism has shaped our society and continues to shape it. So there are young people today who are growing up in an environment that might seem post-racial. And so the challenge is to constantly make them aware of, like, hey, this doesn't have to make you cynical or anything like that, but you need to be aware of how this idea, this construct of race is affecting you.
Oh, thank you so much for explaining that, because I didn't realize, the 2040, that the minority majority thing is
Yeah,
actually happening. I just,
happening right
because
now.
you think as an adult. So, wow, that is just so interesting to me. And then I found another interesting thing about your book is you had that framework of ARC.
Yes.
ARC. I just thought, I wish I had come up with that. But it is awareness, relationships, and commitment. So
You got it.
you use that as a guide to fight racism. So can you explain to the listeners what that is? Because I just found it so interesting. I wish I had come up with it.
Well, I don't know if other folks have had this problem, but I'm a very simple-minded person. If it's not
Uh-huh.
very evident and clear, it's
Uh-huh.
gonna be a struggle for me. I'll get it, but it's gonna take a while. So one of the
Mhm.
things that was a struggle for me, among people who write and talk about anti-racism,
Mhm.
is two things. One, and I'll include myself in this, we don't tend to address solutions nearly as much
Mm.
as we talk about the problems. Part of that's understandable. Takes a long time to unpack this issue and understand what's happening. But at the same time, if people are reading these books or accessing this teaching, they want to be part of the solution. And so we weren't offering proportionally nearly as much. So there was just a lack of addressing it in general. But the other problem I found is that even when folks like me did address it, it was hard to follow. I mean, it would essentially boil down to like a list of action steps at the end of the chapter or the book, and it would
Mm.
essentially be like a bullet point list of all this random smattering of things, big and small, that you should do. And it's hard to take action on anything like that. The brain needs mnemonic devices to help us remember. And so that's where the arc of racial justice comes in. So,
It's
number one, we have to address it. And number two, let's put it in a coherent framework that we can think about. So, what I love about this, anything that you can think of as far as fighting racism will fit in the arc of racial justice. So, if I want to watch a documentary on the March to Selma, that fits in the awareness category. I am building information, data, knowledge about race and racism. That's going to a museum, that's reading a book, all of those things, right? But we can't just stay there. That's what a lot of people did in 2020 with the George Floyd uprisings and all of that. They read all these books. My book became a New York Times bestseller in that era, but awareness is not enough. There's another part, there's relationships. And so what we have to remember is the human element in all this. Why are we fighting racism? Why are we working toward racial justice? It's for the flourishing of our neighbors. And so for white people, that means being proactive and intentional about building relationships with people who are different from you. And that's a really big challenge because throughout US history, white people have built walls. Now you have to build bridges, and that's going to take as much or even
yeah.
more effort as building the walls. For people of color, that means building relationships with each other. It means solidarity. It means alliances. It means gathering together. The most dangerous force against white supremacy is oppressed and marginalized people coming together in common cause and fighting against it. And there's been many, many efforts to prevent that. So we got to come together. But even then, it's not enough. This is where I think the evangelical racial reconciliation movement went wrong. It was all individualized. It was all about handshakes and hugs and coming together and heart-to-heart conversations over a cup of coffee or tea, right? Like that's relationship building. It's good, it's fine, but it's not enough. So that's where commitment comes in. And when I say commitment, I don't just mean being dedicated or staying the course. I mean committing to structural systemic change. We got to understand racism operates through policies and systems. And this isn't even just on a political governmental level. Institutions, colleges, universities, media outlets all have their own policies that can either help racial justice or hurt it. Even our own families have informal customs and policies that will help lead to greater understanding or prevent it. And so we need to work on systemic, structural, institutional levels for racial change. And the arc of racial justice is just to help us make sense of it all.
Thank you for explaining that. And then when you were going on about, these systems that are in our schools and our workplaces, I would say even in Christianity too,
Yes.
and you go over some of this in the book. And I love it that you just kind of named racism as sin. And in the church, that's so hard to do. We don't want to do that. So I'm so glad you did it. Why do you find it so difficult for people in the church to just name it as sin?
So I think you and I wouldn't struggle naming it
Yeah.
as sin because in our own distinct ways, we've experienced marginalization and oppression due to white supremacy and racism. And so what we're really talking about are predominantly white Christian traditions and churches that are struggling to name it, if they want to name it at all, as sin. And I think one of the reasons why that's such a big deal is because it's so common. If we name racism as sin, which from the pulpit, in a sermon, in a Sunday school class, they'll say that abstractly. What they will hesitate to do is to actually name it in their own historical tradition or in their own church. I'll just give you one quick example. I went to Reformed Theological Seminary, about as conservative a place as you can go. And it's ostensibly a non-denominational seminary, but its founders were mostly Southern Presbyterian. The Southern in Southern Presbyterian is when they split off from their Northern counterparts during the Civil War in preservation of slavery. So the Southern Presbyterians were pro-slavery Christians, which sounds very oxymoronic to me. So they wrote an institutional history on the 40th anniversary of the seminary. It was a historian employed by the seminary. He's a professor there. Actually, he's a librarian who does history, but he wrote the book. And in it, he called it the war between the states rather than the Civil War. He mentions Southern Presbyterianism, but there's no mention of their pro-slavery doctrine or ideology. Then he mentions these lights of Southern Presbyterianism, like James Henley Thornwell, Robert Louis Dabney, and some others who were notorious pro-slavery theologians, wrote volumes about how Black people's rightful place was beneath white people. That's an institutional history that they've refused to be honest about in just that one section of an anniversary of the history of their institution. Now, that's a seminary. Churches do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
If your church was around from, I would say, 1970 and before, you would be well advised to take a good hard look at, let's say, the church minutes of meetings that happened, let's say about the rulings and the decisions that were voted on in those meetings, and see if there's any mention of racism. I mean, what was going on at your church during the civil rights movement? Were they involved? Were they speaking against it? Were they in support of it? There's a history there that we have yet to tell in many of our Christian institutions. So all that to come back to your answer, why is it so hard to name racism as sin? It is so pervasive. We're not honest about it. And I think folks are, number one, they're in agreement with some of these racist ideas, whether they'll say that or not. And number two, if they started actually disciplining people for the sin of racism, there would be a whole lot of people caught up in that. So
that is actually a great idea. we discipline people with the sexual sins,
Yes.
those who commit, assault and things like that. That's a great idea. I never thought of it that way. But it is so pervasive. It is so embedded in our churches, in Christianity itself, in the birth of the church here in the US, when you think about how it even rose and what we did to the Native Americans here, and then the enslavement of African Americans, and even to Asian Americans. It is a big sin. So I'm so grateful for you to name it as sin. That also leads me, you had included 9 notable Black individuals. And I found it very helpful because I didn't grow up in the States. I grew up in Canada. And to learn about, well, I learned about Emmett Till, but there were other people here. So how did you narrow it down to the 9 people? Because I thought it was so well written. It's like, I think everybody kind of needs to read it. Adults too, who never grew up here, who didn't read it in their schools, in the education system, or never came across it. How did you kind of narrow it down to the 9 people?
Well, I have to give credit to my co-author who helped me adapt it. It's Josh Mosey. And so we looked at the adult version and some of the people involved there, and that was part of it. Another part of it was, this is my own little thesis, is that the people we think we're most familiar with are often the most misunderstood. So I deliberately tried to include more well-known names like Frederick Douglass in there.
Mhm.
We've heard of Frederick Douglass, obviously, right? But do we really know much about him
Yeah.
beyond, something we heard from somewhere from someone, right? So I wanted to dig in, especially for young people who may not have heard of these folks, but they will
Mhm.
encounter them. Let's
Mhm.
build a good foundation early on. People like Rosa Parks, others who many of us have heard of, but I wanted specifically to talk about their struggle against racism, what motivated them. We talk about Kamala Harris's journey in faith. We talk about Ruby Bridges. We talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, who is one of my historical heroes. She's from the Delta where I live. So I think it is pretty representative of, in particular, Black Christians who are struggling against racism.
Oh, thank you so much. And then you give a really good historical approach to this of racism,
Yes.
and you talk about the war, the Confederacy, etc. What is something that we adults kind of skip over that we should be reminded of?
We
If you can
skip
say a little bit.
over,
Uh-huh.
yeah, we skip over the Reconstruction and Redemption era.
Mm,
So immediately following the Civil War from 1865 to 1877, which was the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, you have what's called Reconstruction. And if you think about it, this was in US history the best time to
mm,
make real the promises of democracy, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. It was the best time to actually enact a multiracial pluralistic democracy. And there was progress. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, so-called. There was the Freedmen's Bureau. This is the period in time where Black people, we started our own churches and denominations. We started our own schools. We started training for nurses and medicine. We found lost relatives. We got engaged in politics, right? It was this incredible time when Black people disproved what white supremacists were saying, which is that we couldn't handle freedom, that the
mm.
only way we could survive in the United States was to be under white people, particularly in the race-based chattel slavery system. So we totally proved that wrong. But then, I mean, that barely lasted a decade. And then you have this compromise where Southerners in a very close election agreed to give President Hayes the presidency. In exchange, he would withdraw federal troops from the South. And that period that followed was known as redemption. Now, as Christians, when we hear redemption, we think of good news. We think of, God saving sinners, or whatever it might be. But
Uh-huh.
in the hands of white supremacists in the South, redemption meant taking back the South for the white man. It meant reestablishing in a post-slavery era white supremacy. And that is the period that became known as Jim Crow. And so when we look at the late 19th century, that's a critical phase of US history that determines really the course and trajectory of the next 150 years.
Wow. Thank you for reminding us, because I think many adults just skip over that, or we just ignore that part of our history. So thank you. Near the end of the book, you talk about exploring your racial identity. I think this
Mm,
is so important for young people.
yes.
For my own story, I was born in Korea and then we
Uh,
immigrated to Canada. And so I grew up in Canada. And then I remember because of so much racism, I wanted to deny my racial identity. I thought I should just be like the rest of the white kids and do as much as I can to become white. But you really tell the readers, you need to explore your racial identity. Did you want to say more about that?
I really think that's one of the most important parts of the book. And I flipped to it because I just wanted to get it right. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I became aware of this model of racial identity development, which social psychologists use. And I became aware of it in college. And it was so helpful for me because it helped me to name some of the stuff that I was going through. So it's a 5-stage kind of process. And by the way, I don't think it's never ending, right? Like
Yeah.
I think in different seasons of life, you kind of cycle back through
Yeah.
because you're just in a different context. So it's not
Uh-huh.
like something
Yeah.
you arrive at. But
Mhm. Yeah.
so it was developed originally by a guy named William Cross, who called it the theory of nigrescence or the theory of becoming black. It's been adapted and revised since then. But here are some of the stages. Stage 1 is pre-encounter. We're all just people. Is that stage? Stage 2 is encounter, realizing my color wasn't supposed to matter, but clearly it does. And usually that encounter phase is a negative encounter, right? Being pulled over by the police, being called a racial slur, not seeing yourself represented in media, whatever it might be. Stage 3 is immersion. And that is characterized that even though society tells me differently, I finally believe there's something beautiful about the way I'm created. So this is the, black and proud phase for black people. Black is beautiful, but it's saying I love who I am and how I'm created. But it's also a kind of deliberate uh stepping back from predominantly white. It's not, it's a stage where you said you kind of need to go into yourself and into your culture to find the beauty and the joy in it, and sort of be cocooned off from these predominantly white places that are sending different messages. Stage 4, internalization. You confidently declare, I'm comfortable in the skin I'm in. So you can go back out into these various areas and be who you are. So it's more re-entering kind of a thing with a firmer foundation of your identity. And then stage 5 is commitment. I can learn from anyone of any race or ethnicity. So this is just a very relaxed, comfortable, I am who I am, you are who you are, and I can learn from you, as well as I don't have to be aggressive about, asserting my value and the value of my race, ethnicity, or culture. But if it comes to it, I can speak on it. No problem. I can go there if we need to. So it's just it's almost being at peace with yourself and being able then to go into lots of different areas and be who you need to be and learn from others as well.
Yeah, because if you're not at peace with yourself, it's difficult to do anything, any form of ministry or anything in your workplace. So thank you for reminding us. And I just really love the concise way that you put that. And for parents who are raising kids who are, and it's not just the racial identity, there are different forms of identity that they're struggling with. I think reading that part of your book will be so helpful for young people. And then, as you said, it's this ongoing thing. So I think even as adults, some of us are
That's
struggling
right. That's right.
continuously. So I
Yep.
think it's just so important part of the book. And if you're gonna just read one section, just read that one. I think that I highly recommend it. And then you kind of end the book with, how to work for racial justice.
Mm,
And this is, you know, this is such an important work, and we say it all the time, but none of us, well, many of us don't want to work on it because we become a little lazy, we get busy, and then, we just have other things to do. So, but to really tell it for young people, the young readers, how to work for racial justice, can you kind of expand on that and share some points with us?
Yes. So this was also one of the challenges of writing the book. How do you come up with age appropriate
Yeah.
practical steps for young people to take to fight
Mhm.
racism? Now the whole book is arranged according to that arc of racial justice we're talking about. So there's a section on awareness, one on race relationships, and another on commitment. In every single chapter, there are practical, actionable steps. But just to give you examples from the awareness area, I say talk to slash interview older members in your family and
Mm.
talk to them about what it was like for them growing up. Ask them, what is their earliest memory of race? Who taught them the most about, did they ever experience racism? What were they doing, in, I don't know, 1968 when King was assassinated or something like that, right? So we can learn a lot from people in our own family. Another part of awareness is self-awareness. So I say, write your own racial autobiography. Think about your own earliest memory of race, your own encounters with race and racism. And even in a very short life, we'll still have those memories. We're starting to encounter race and racism at 3, 4, 5 years old. And
Yeah.
so can we sort of catalog that? With relationships, of course, it's actually easier for young people to make friends. They're in class, they're in school, they're in activities with people all in the same sort of age and stage of life. And so I say, like, keep it simple. Walk up to somebody and say, hey, will you be my friend? Which is just another way of saying, can we get to know each other? And encouraging young people to do that across racial and ethnic lines, not having, these cliques and these groups that exclude. What does it look like to break those barriers and to move beyond those boundaries? And then on the commitment aspect, there are so many creative ways. I encourage young people, run for student government. See
Mhm.
how rules are actually made, rules that affect you on a day-to-day basis. It is going to be incredibly boring, but if you can get your kid to go to a school board meeting, that
Mhm.
would be a really informative way of saying, this is how your school is structured. This group of people gets together, they talk, they vote, and this is how, and you can participate in that as well. And there's certainly other things we can do, like starting book clubs or doing reports or asking teachers for different help and advice. So there's actually ends up being a whole lot that young people can do and be very effective at. All I want to do with this book for young readers is communicate to young people, you have agency.
Mm.
You have the ability to affect your circumstances. You can't do everything, but we can all do something. And if that's the one thing they walk away with, that I have the power to make my voice heard and to take action on behalf of others and in promotion of racial justice, then it's all worth it.
Wow, you are such an inspiration just listening to you. I feel like I'm listening to some sermon and a charge and a benediction to go out and use your agency. That's so wonderful. So thank you so much. How would you suggest, because one of them you just suggested, start a book club. I think that'd be great if young people can get together and do a book club on this, either in their school or in their churches, in their faith community, their neighborhoods. How would you suggest people to read this book, either in a book club or with their parents or an adult, an aunt or uncle or their mentor? How should people be using this book? Because it's such an important book. And, your age group, you aimed it for 8 and I think 12 or something. Was it 8 to
Mhm,
12?
mhm.
But I
That's
think
right.
it's for all readers.
That's
To
right.
be
That's
honest, I
right.
think you should just change it to all readers edition.
That's right. I like
Yeah.
that. I like that.
But how would you suggest that we use it?
Such a great question. There's many ways to use it. So, a book-based approach. You could just read this one-on-one with the young people in your life. There are discussion questions at the end
Yeah.
of each
Which
chapter.
I love. I love those
Yeah,
discussion
and
questions,
and
I
these
must
were,
say.
again, Josh Mosey helped me with these. I think these are
Mhm,
actually pretty rich questions if you
mhm.
dig into it,
Yeah.
and you can just do it that way. Another way to do it is, and so adults and young people can read along together. There's a person who tagged me on social media. I love it. She on her own, basically, I think it's the neighborhood. She just asked parents to and said, I'm doing this book club. And she got together, a group of kids, they get together, they talk about the book, they have treats, and they just hang out.
Wow.
And so I just liked it because it was like,
Amazing.
it wasn't just through school or whatever.
Yeah.
She's reaching out in her community. But here's the best part. I so believe in the message of this book that I made it multimedia. So I have a kid who's not really a reader. He's definitely a learner, but not really a reader. So what we did was I made a podcast series
Ah,
for young readers. And here's the coolest part. I got to go into a school and
uh-huh.
talk to actual 4th and 5th graders, so right in this age range, about race and racism. So you're going to hear the voices of actual kids in
Oh,
this podcast. So it would be awesome. And they're only about 15 minutes each or so.
oh,
So
that's
it's designed like on
amazing.
the way to school or coming back or going to groceries, whatever. You
Wow.
listen to it with your kid, and that's a discussion starter. So there's a podcast series. And one more thing,
Uh-huh.
there is a YouTube video series based on the book. So
Wow.
if you
Yeah.
wanted to, you could watch these 15-20 minute videos,
Uh-huh.
again, geared toward kids. There's graphics, there's stories, there's all this stuff. And you can use that
Wow.
as a jumping off point for a conversation. And it's
Oh.
not completely identical to the book. So you're
Mhm.
going to get some content with the
Yeah.
podcast and the video that's
Uh-huh.
not in the book.
Yeah. Mhm.
But all of this, I mean, it's just, here's the only thing that's stopping us is taking action. Just do it. Just pick
Wow.
one and say, like, here's the time and place, let's go. And I
That
promise
is
you, there's going to be incredible conversation, dialogue, and even action coming from it. All you have to do is get started.
wow, that is amazing. So where is the podcast and where is the YouTube address? What is it?
So if you just look up Jemar Tisby, my YouTube channel, because the
Okay.
URL is all complicated.
Uh-huh.
And then the Footnotes podcast,
Oh,
Footnotes
footnotes.
with
That's your
Jemar
own
Tisby.
podcast then.
That's right. That's right.
Oh,
And
okay.
just to make it convenient, there is
Uh-huh.
a blog post on my newsletter, jamartisby.substack.com. It's got links to the book, the podcast, and the video.
You are so amazing. You know, when I was younger, I loved history. And
Good.
and then one of my teachers said, "What are you going to do when you get older?" I said, "Maybe I'll study history." And they said, "What are you going to do with a history degree?" And look at you with a history degree, a PhD. You are an author, podcaster. You started the Witness Inc. You've just multi-talented. I know you're on TikTok too. I started TikTok and nobody's following me, so I quit TikTok.
I understand. I'm
Yeah,
just
you're
trying to
on
keep up with the young
TikTok. You
people.
are just everywhere. And I would love to continue talking about this book, but I know you got to go. But before you leave, I wanted to say, how does it feel to be called the New York Times bestselling author?
It,
I want that title one day. It'll never happen, but how does it feel?
it's a really good question, because I'm one of those people who no matter what I've accomplished, no matter what I've done, it doesn't seem good enough, it doesn't seem remarkable or whatever. But even I couldn't deny, like, New York Times bestselling author.
Oh,
That has some weight to it.
oh,
That's
a
an
ton of weight.
accomplishment, right? So for me, as a constant, person who's trying to hustle, who's trying to make his time on this earth worthwhile, that's not everything, but it's one thing I can point to that said, okay, I was on to something there, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
recognized. So it's just reassuring to me to keep going. And I think to all of us, aside from the accolades of what we do, need to affirm each other. And Grace, I've loved this conversation. You are such an encourager. I think it's a gift that you have through the Holy Spirit
Oh,
to encourage people. Listen, can we just reach out and say, listen, I see this in you. And I recognize this as a gift, as a talent, as a skill, and especially with our young people. There were people in my life who said, Jemar, you're an excellent writer. Jemar, you're an excellent speaker. And I remember those things. And it's come back to me again and again over decades. And you never know how, I'm not saying make anything up or be fluffy, but you never know how honestly and candidly recognizing someone's gifts and skills will affect them positively. And we just need so much more of that in our lives.
We sure do. I'm so moved and touched by you. I felt like I was listening to a whole sermon, a benediction and a charge and everything else. So I hope all the listeners will go out and buy this, How to Fight Racism, young readers edition, or I would call it all readers edition.
All readers, yes, I like that.
Excellent. I think people should read it together in groups and individuals, intergenerational. I think it's a great book for the church and for the school. So people just reach out and get this book. I think it's such an important book. So Dr. Jemar Tisby, thank you so much. I know you're so busy. Thank you so much for being a guest on my Madang, and hope to see you someplace, sometime face to face. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Homebrew Christianity is holding Theology Beer Camp October 13 to 15 at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Homebrewed is bringing together a bunch of podcasters, scholars, and people who like to nerd out when they party. They want to create a pop-up community of those zesty people who enjoy a quality God pod in their ears. Please join me and many others. Use discount code MADANG to get $50 off registration. For more information, go to www.onepages.co/tbc22/. Madang is sponsored by Methodist Theological School in Ohio. MTSO provides theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. MTSO's 5 graduate degrees include the Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Social Justice, and Doctor of Ministry. Learn more at www.mtso.edu. Please join Global Justice leader Lisa Sharon Harper as she hosts the Alley Tour 2022. It is a 4 nights of conversation, woman to woman, on democracy, faith, and the fate of America. It will be held October 3rd, 10th, 17th, 24th, leading up to the November 8th midterm elections. For more information and tickets, go to www.thealleytour.com.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com.